All right. What a great time. We've been in a study for the past few weeks out of the book of Nehemiah, and I have really grown to love this book. I hope that it's really catching a hold of your heart and that God is teaching you a lot as we walk through this together. It's really interesting as you work through the historical narrative material in the Old Testament. It's interesting how the story reads, and you get into certain chapters and you just kind of scratch your head and you think, why do we have this chapter? And so I give you that warning this morning before we jump into chapter 3. Because on first glance, we could read this chapter and we could ask ourselves, why in the world is this in here? Because what you're going to discover is that it is a list of Hebrew names that I've not been able to hear anyone pronounce correctly, including myself. In fact, it's 32 verses of these Hebrew names. And so it can be challenging as we work through this text, but I've had the privilege really to sit under this text for a while now, and honestly, this has become one of my favorite chapters out of the book of Nehemiah. I have truly grown to love this chapter, and I hope today that you will develop a kindred spirit for this chapter as well. So a lot of times people will work through the book of Nehemiah. Many commentaries will actually not deal with much emphasis whatsoever on chapter 3. But this morning we're going to specifically look at verses 1 to 9. So I want to dive into this text together, and let's hear the word of God this morning. Verse 1, Then Eliashib, the high priest, arose with his brothers, the priests, and built the sheep gate. You'll remember that this is about the story about rebuilding the wall. That's Nehemiah. He's on this journey. He was in Babylon, and he's rebuilding the wall. And so he's giving us information about what's taken place now that he's been able to go back to Jerusalem. High priest begins to build the sheep gate. They consecrated it, hung its doors. They consecrated the wall to the Tower of the 100 and the Tower of Hanel. Next to him, the men of Jericho built, and next to them, Zakur, the son of Imri, built. Now the sons of Hassanah built the fish gate. They laid its beams and hung its doors with its bolts and bars. Next to them, Meremoth, the son of Uriah, the son of Hekaz, made repairs. And next to them, Meshulam, the son of Berechiah, the son of Meshazabel, made repairs. And next to him, Zadok, the son of Benah, also made repairs. Moreover, next to him, the Tekoites made repairs and built their nobles, but their nobles did not support the work of their masters. Continuing in verse 6, Joiada, the son of Pesia, and Meshullam, the son of Bezodelah, repaired the old gate and laid its beams and hung its doors with its bolts and its bars. Next to them, Mathaliah, the Gibeonite, and Jadon, the Meronothite, the men of Gibeon and of Mizpah, also made repairs for the official seat of the governor of the province beyond the river. Next to him, Uziel, the son of Hariah, of the goldsmith, made repairs. And next to him, Hananiah, son of the perfumers, made repairs. And they restored Jerusalem as far as the broad wall. Next to them, Rephaiah, son of Hur, the official of half of the district of Jerusalem, made repairs. Now, there are 32 verses that read like this, and to spare you of my inability to pronounce Hebrew names well, we're just going to cut it off at verse 9. And in fact, many of you know my wife and I are going to be out of town next week, and Clint Eccles, many of you have had the opportunity to meet him. He is going to be preaching, and when I first laid this out, I was really thinking that chapter 3 was going to take place next week. And so to my demise, I discovered, no, it's not going to take place next week. It's going to take place this week. And he was reading this, and he said to me, you know, chapter 3 of Nehemiah is where preachers go to die. I mean, this is a difficult chapter. It's name after name after name, 32 verses. And so we come before this text and we ask the question, why do we have this in our Bible? Well, why is this chapter 3 in our Bible? 32 verses, name after name after name. Now, it's very important for us to understand that at this particular juncture in the history of the people, the people of God, there's going to be a transition that begins to take place. And many people have missed this, but it's a very important transition. You'll remember when God started out with the people of Israel, he worked with one specific person. He began with Abraham, and then after Abraham, we read the story of Joseph, and that's one individual there. And then we read the story of Moses, and on and on and on. We have story after story after story. And early on in the Old Testament, what we see is that God would come and he would use an individual. That there would be a person that God would use to do his work. And you'll recall the great story of David. I mean, we have so many Old Testament stories that identify the great heroes of the Old Testament. David. We have the story of Solomon, King Solomon building the temple. Here, at this particular juncture in the Old Testament, a transition is taking place. And it's very important to catch this. And that transition is that God is moving away from working through an individual to working through a corporate people, the group. And it's very subtle, but it's very important to understand. And so we always ask the question, and it's a very important question for us to ask, what is the main point of this text? And when we ask that question, we're asking a question that says, when it was originally written, why was it written? Why do we have that? And so, as best I can discern, the main point of this text is that this chapter represents God's plan for restoring his glory to the city of Jerusalem. Now, we've talked about this, chapter 1, chapter 2, and again in chapter 3. The city of Jerusalem was the city of David. It was the city of the people of God. And it's very important to remember that the glory of God was there in the city. It was there. And so we have this chapter to tell us, to enlighten us on how God is restoring his glory to the city. So the obvious next question that we always need to ask is, what is the purpose for this text for us today? And as I look at this, the people of Nehemiah chapter 3 literally lay a foundation for both humility and unity. And I want you to grasp those two words. In fact, you can write down in your notes the word humility and the word unity. And we're going to be driving that and looking at those two words specifically today. So what is the point of the sermon? What are we trying to do in this sermon? And this is what I want you to understand this morning. The gospel is advanced when our lives are marked by humility and unity. Chapter 3, Nehemiah, is going to provide for us examples of people who were greatly humbled and people who were unified. They walked together. And what we need to see today as we read through chapter 3, we need to understand that the gospel, the commission to go and advance the gospel, that is done when our lives are marked by humility and unity. It's a great reminder. In fact, we're going to focus on humility and unity by examining two phrases that are used throughout this chapter. Again, 32 verses. And if you were to read all 32 verses, you would see these two phrases appear over and over again. The first phrase that I want to call your attention to this morning is the phrase made repairs. Made repairs. In fact, it begins up there in Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 1, and all throughout the chapter it says that they made repairs. The people were before the wall, and they made repairs. Now, get in your mind that as we think about this wall, it's not as if they're going to establish a brand new wall. In fact, they're going to repair the wall. And there's a whole list of individuals who are here, and they're making the repairs. In fact, he begins the explanation of the repairs at the wall of Jerusalem, there at the Sheep Gate. And very interestingly, this was pointed out in our community group this past week, and it certainly is true that you'll notice that the people who are making repairs there is the high priest. And he's going to be the one that's involved specifically with the sacrifices. That's his detail. Other people are going to make an extended repair on the wall. Some people, as you read through chapter 3, are going to make a repair that literally is in front of their house, the place where they lived. And so if you were there in a city and the wall was broken and you wanted to have security, you want to make sure that the wall that's in front of your house has been repaired well. And so this is all about the people coming together to make repairs. And this was no easy task. Sometimes I think that it's a lot easier to just start from scratch than trying to go in and repair something. Let's just start brand new. Let's just start fresh. Don't try to repair it. Let's just start new. Sometimes I think that's easier. And certainly the people in the time of Nehemiah who are making the repair, they were a laughing stock to those around them. You'll see this particularly next week as you study chapter 4. But I want to draw your attention to this in chapter 4, Nehemiah verse 2. Here's the questioning that's taking place by those who are watching the people make these repairs. What are these feeble Jews doing? Are they going to restore it for themselves? Can they offer sacrifices? Can they finish in a day? They must have been really after it, working hard. Can they revive the stones from the dusty rubble, even the burned ones? Now, we can't miss this. As the stones were there, as the stones were laying there in the ruins, you'll recall that they find themselves in the situation because of Babylon. The Babylonians had come in and they had destroyed the city. They destroyed the temple. And it took place because of their rebellious heart. They had turned their hearts away from God. They began serving other gods, other idols. And God says, I'm not going to have anything to do with this. I'm going to carry you off into captivity for 70 years. And that's what happens. And so in this process, there's this great wall destruction that's taking place there in Jerusalem. The walls are destroyed. Now, Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 1, very important to see this, says the high priest arose with his brothers, the priest, and built the sheep gate. And notice the word there, they consecrated it and hung its doors. In fact, if we were to continue reading, we would see that exact same word, consecrate, we would see that appear again. And I think it's interesting to point out that the word consecrate here is the Hebrew word kadosh. And the word kadosh is the word holy. So imagine in your mind, they're there before all of the rubble. They're looking at the destruction of the stones, laying in pieces. And the priest is there and he is praying over it and saying, God, this is holy. This is holy. This is set apart. This is unlike any other stone. people would look at that and they would think, this guy has lost his mind. I mean, what are you talking about? This is holy. This is set apart. The destroyed walls were proclaimed holy for the work of God. Now, we can't lose sight of this running throughout the book of Nehemiah. A few weeks back, we had the opportunity to go over into the book of Ezekiel and look specifically at the glory departing from the temple. There are 2 chapters in the book of Ezekiel that talk about God's glory departing from Israel. And what I want us to do today is I want us to fast forward to the time when God's glory descended upon the temple. When God's glory came upon the temple. When it made its way to the temple. And that would take us back to the time of Solomon. In fact, if we try to get our history correct, this is about 600 years before Nehemiah. Solomon is about 600 years before Nehemiah. And the book of 2 Chronicles is quite the book. I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to read through the book of 2 Chronicles, but it gives us the story of the temple being built. In fact, I would encourage you at some point to take time and read through 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles chapter 3 records for us the building of the temple. And this was quite the temple. It was elaborate. It was an amazing temple. 2 Chronicles chapter 3 chronicles that for us. 2 Chronicles chapter 4 talks about bringing the furniture into the temple. You know, you get the new temple, you got to have new furniture to go into the temple, right? And so that is 2 Chronicles chapter 4. 2 Chronicles chapter 5 tells the story of the Ark of the Covenant coming into the temple. And any of you watch Indiana Jones, you know, the search of the Ark of the Covenant? Well, it's actually a real thing, and the Ark of the Covenant represented the glory of God. They would, the Hebrew people were nomadic, and they would go on the journey, and they would carry the Ark of the Covenant with them. And it contained within it the 10 Commandments. And it was a reminder of God's presence. And so they bring, in chapter 5, the Ark of the Covenant into the temple. In 2 Chronicles chapter 6, they dedicate the temple to the Lord. Solomon dedicates it. He's the king at this time, and he prays over it. He dedicates this temple to the Lord. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, the glory of the Lord descends upon the temple. And it remained there. His glory remained in that city for about up until the time of the Babylonian captivity. So for about 500 years. And it was there, and it was a very special place. God's glory enters the temple. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, I want to read for you just 3 verses to let you hear about the glory of God descending upon the temple. Now, when Solomon had finished praying, he had dedicated the temple, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. And notice, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. I don't know what it would be like to be in the house where the glory of the Lord has filled that place. But that's what happened. It's an amazing expression. His glory is there. Notice verse 2, the priest could not enter into the house, the Lord, because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. All the sons of Israel, seeing the fire come down and the glory of the Lord upon the house, bowed down on the pavement with their faces to the ground. And they worshiped and gave praise to the Lord, saying, truly he is good. Truly his loving kindness is everlasting. So they're caught up in God's glory coming down to this place, this very special place. And they're caught up in his glory, and they're saying, wow, this is amazing to see his glory come down. Now, the next few verses in 2 Chronicles chapter 7 talk about sacrifices that take place. In fact, Solomon, get this, offered 22,000 oxen as a sacrifice. He also offered 122,000 sheep to the Lord as a sacrifice. Think about that. That's a sacrifice that he gave to the Lord. He's saying, God, you are holy. Your glory is here. We are overwhelmed with your presence. And then, a very famous passage in 2 Chronicles chapter 7. I want to read this for you because it's going to point us to Nehemiah chapter 3. Notice, then the Lord appeared to Solomon at night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. Notice verse 13. If I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or if I command the locusts to devour the land, or if I send pestilence among my people, you know this passage, and my people who are called by my name humble themselves, turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sins and I will heal their land. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayer offered in this place. How would you like that for a promise from God? Here in this place, when you come here, my eyes are on this place. When you come here, my ears are open to your prayers. Nowhere else on earth at this time was the glory of God so prevalent. Nowhere else. Special place. And now, 600 years later, during the time of Nehemiah, they are laid in ruins. Now, I really think that 2 Chronicles chapter 7, that 14 and 15, 13, 14, and 15, points us to chapter 3 of Nehemiah. Because that's exactly what they're doing. They are humbled before God. These people are humbled before God. Not only did the broken walls, the rubble that laid in the streets, represent the fact that God's glory had departed from that place, but it also represented people who were broken. Their brokenness was evident. Could you imagine if the people tried to carry on business, to go through life like nothing had ever happened? Like the walls were still there? They're just going to carry on every day like nothing had ever happened with the walls? That they ignore the broken down walls? No, they could not do that. Governance could not take place in this area. Commerce could not take place in this area because the walls were broken. And the walls were broken represented the departure of God's glory, but it also represented a broken people. They're broken. Now I want you to hear this. It's very important. The path of brokenness leads to humility. If you're asking the question, how do I get there? How do I make that journey to humility? You need to understand this morning that the path of brokenness leads to humility. Some of you know exactly what that is like. Some of you have experienced brokenness, and you didn't just sit back and ignore the brokenness that's there. You recognize the brokenness, and God used it in your life in a very special way, in a very prominent way, and as a result of that, you are on a path to humility. Humility is present. And so we see here that the path of brokenness leads to humility. There's a second phrase that I want to call your attention to in Nehemiah chapter 3. And that is the phrase, next to them. Over and over and over again. Basically, Nehemiah chapter 3 is 32 verses of a Hebrew name followed by the phrase, next to them. There's the Hebrew name, next to them. Over and over and over again, this phrase appears next to them. I love the fact that, again, in chapter 3, verse 1, it starts out the fact that the high priest, Eliashib, and his brothers started the work. Now, this is very important to comprehend. The high priest could never be imagined as a person who would get out there and start constructing a wall, going through the rubble, picking the rocks, pulling them out. He goes out there, he rolls up his sleeves, and he says, we're going to get after it. We're going to do the work of the Lord. And again, this is a foreshadow for us of how it is to be among God's people, how we as the body of Christ should function. And here we have the beautiful example of everybody had the attitude of all hands on deck. Everybody signed up and they showed up and they gave themselves to the work. Now there were a couple of people that did not cooperate. Could you imagine being them? They're mentioned in Nehemiah chapter 3. And they're identified as people that did not participate. Could you imagine that you make the Bible? I mean, you're in the Bible, but your identity is the person who refused to pick up rocks and stones and build the wall. That's your identity. That follows you around. That's who you are. And it's true also for the body of Christ that when we come together as God's people, that we must have the attitude of all hands on deck. And God has gifted the body in that way. That there are various gifts. There are gifts of administration. There are gifts of teaching. All kinds of gifts. Listen, church is not a spectator sport. You don't come, sit, get entertained, go home, pay your dues, come back next week. That's not how it works. Church is all hands on deck. We are getting after it. Why? For the glory of God. It doesn't matter how young you are, how old you are. You're still going to get after it. I hope that I have the opportunity to live long enough that I'm in a nursing home somewhere and I'm just murmuring to a person over in the corner, sharing the gospel with them, chasing them down in my wheelchair, going after them. You know, I'm after it. I'm there. That's where I want to be. That's how I want to go. We don't have a retirement clause here. It doesn't matter. We're getting after it. All hands on deck. And so it starts with the high priest, but others joined the activity. It didn't just stay there. They came together as a group of people, and this foreshadows for us the great example of the church today. Nehemiah repeats the names of people that worked on the wall over and over again. If you were to count through the times and the groups of people, you would discover that there are about 40 different groups that are mentioned in Nehemiah chapter 3. 40 different groups. So again, we ask the question, why did he list all of these names? And I've come to the conclusion, after spending time in Nehemiah chapter 3, that if you are looking for a group of people in the Old Testament that provides an image of the New Testament church, Nehemiah chapter 3 is your place. This is where you go. If you want to provide a picture of how the church should function, pick up a brick. Pick up a stone, because here it is. And what we see here is we see a beautiful example of people coming together, and there's great unity in this story. The resounding character that they demonstrated here in Nehemiah chapter 3 is unity. These were a unified people. So how do we achieve this? Much like the question of how do we achieve humility? The path to brokenness leads us to humility. The question that we need to consider is how in the world do we achieve unity? And let me tell you, it's very simple. It's very simple. If we want to be a church that is unified, it's very simple. The New Testament explains it for us very carefully. And the New Testament basically says you will not have unity without love. It just will not happen. You will not, as the body of Christ, have unity without love. Jesus said in John 13:37, by this the people will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. If you love one another, people will tell that you are my disciples. You cannot have unity among God's people without love. We must learn how to love well. We must really learn how to do that well. Paul writes about this in many, many places, but perhaps there's no better place than Ephesians chapter 4, where Paul writes about the importance of this. I love this. Listen for the word humility and listen for the word love and unity. It's just all in this passage, verses 1 through 3. Therefore, I, prisoner of the Lord, implore you. In other words, I beg you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. How do we get unity? We love each other. We treat each other in a loving way. And if we don't, we might as well just call ourselves a social club and call it a day. Because the people of God are marked by love. It's a characteristic of unity that the world does not know. They cannot comprehend. I remember throughout my ministry, had several occasions similar to this, but I'd received an email from a guy, and my wife and I had visited this family, and things looked good, things were great, and I received an email just a few days later, kind of an angry email saying, my family and I are leaving the church. We're gone. We're out of here. And I thought, this is kind of weird. I mean, I just talked with you just a few days ago, and I'm getting an email that you're gone. What's that all about? So I called a meeting, got together with the guy, and I'm like, this is not how you do this. This is not how you handle this situation. And I began describing of the process a person should consider before they get to the point of saying, I'm leaving the church. There's a lot of prayer. You need to come before the elders and say, I'm trying to understand this. I'm missing something here. Pray with me. Help me understand this. You don't just do the solo thing and say, we're done, we're out, we're gone. As I began describing this to my friend, he said, I've never seen that as an example. In fact, the examples that I've seen is when you're ready to leave a church, you just get mad at everybody and you don't come back. That's how I've always done it. And that is not New Testament. That's not the gospel. That's not how we function. We must have love for one another. And when we love one another, guess what? God is glorified, and there is unity. God is glorified. There's unity. Obviously, there are times, absolutely, that you say, it is time to go. But that don't mean you become enemies with the church, with the people of God. No, you respond in a loving way, in a caring way. I want to be able to see people that leave this church or any other church that I've been a part of and not dive behind the Jenny Lynn when they're in the grocery store, kind of darting the aisles. There they are. I better go down to aisle number 3. They're on aisle number 6. I better stay over here while they're over there. I don't want to live that way. The people of God are not to live that way. We're to walk in love for one another and have unity as we go through this life. 2 very simple application questions. First one. Are there any indicators in your life that point to brokenness? That point to brokenness. And what I mean by that, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying there. I mean, I guess on a simple level, all of us could stand up and say, yeah, there's my life's a mess. I mean, there's all kinds of things that's going on in my life, and it's not pretty. It's not just acknowledging it. But it's going before God and saying, God, I am a broken person. I'm a sinful person. I am separated from you. You are completely other than me. You are beyond me, and I am so broken. You see, God did not come to make a people great again. God came to make people whole. That's why God came. He came to make people whole. And we can find wholeness through Jesus. And so the very first question that we need to ask, are there any indicators in your life that point to brokenness? God, this is who I am. I am broken. I am separated from you. Lord, I need you in my life to make me whole. I need you to restore the rubble in my life. I need you to put the blocks back together. I need you in my life. The second application question is very, very simple, but so true. How do you demonstrate your love for the body? How do you do that? When you walk and you rub elbows with the people in this church, how do you love well here? Do you love well here? Does this just kind of occupy a certain time of your day every week, or do you really invest yourself in the love of the saints and the love of community here? Because these true things are very true. You will not have humility without brokenness, and you will not have unity without love. That is Nehemiah chapter 3. Let's pray together.